Good afternoon and welcome to what is the first of an occasional series of talks on topical issues in and around sport and personal injury, hosted by Irwin Mitchell Solicitors and Outer Temple Chambers of Barristers. And for the next 90 minutes or so, with no half time, no stopping clock, and certainly no box kicking, we're going to discuss concussion and liability in sports law. I'm Louis Weston. I head up the sports group at Outer Temple, and I'm chairing this talk, which is going to be broken into three parts. The first part is the medical concerns and state of knowledge around the issues of concussion and sport. And when I was organising this talk, I asked some experts who I knew for an expert to speak on concussion, and the name came forward of Dr. Michael Turner, who was the expert's expert. He has a long history of involvement across sport, from horse racing to tennis via skiing, and he has a special interest in research and investigation into head injuries and concussion, which is helpful because he's the medical director and chief executive officer of the International Concussion and Head Injury Research Foundation and co-author of consensus statements on concussion in sports. He'll deal with the medical aspects. Then we're going to turn to the player's perspective, and it's a real honour to have with us David Denton, a man who grew up in Zimbabwe and then South Africa, but no doubt troubled by the warm weather, long hours of sunshine, made his way to his mother's homeland of Scotland, where he studied economics at Edinburgh University, and whilst doing all of those things was playing for the Edinburgh Academicals before going on to win 42 caps for Scotland as a dynamic ball-carrying number 8, alongside a distinguished club career at Bath, Worcester and Leicester. Often accompanied, I've seen, by #Thor in tweets about his play and performance. He's a rare player who everyone admires, and no one, it seems, and I've been looking, has a bad word for him. It's very good to have him and for him to give up his time and to give a player's perspective of the issues in and around concussion. And then the last section is going to be on legal obligations. And to deal with that, not one, we have two lawyers. First, Ian Christian, a partner at Irwin Mitchell, who leads their clinical negligence department and who has a massive experience in litigating and advising in complex litigation, including class actions and catastrophic injury, and has a particular interest in the sport of rugby. He's a straight-talking and approachable lawyer, and that's all unsurprising because he says he came to law as a result of his cousin Vinny, the film, I think. And last but no means least, my colleague Matthew Phillips, Queen's Counsel, recognised as a clinical negligence and personal injury star in the directories. Matthew has a particular interest in practice in injuries arising in the sporting context, with cases of spinal injury in rugby and leg injury and clinical negligence in football. And he has acted as an advocate in doping cases and as the legal chair on the British Equine Federation's anti-doping hearing panel. So there is before you a most excellent, informed and talented panel, and we're going to take them in turns. During their presentations, please feel free to ask any questions you would wish to using the Q&A function within Zoom. And I'm bound to remind you, for no doubt data protection and other issues, that this meeting by Zoom, though it is being recorded. So that's enough from me. You'll hear more from me from time to time. It's over to Michael Turner, who's going to give us a presentation on the medical issues. Michael.
Thank you very much indeed, Louis, and thank you all for joining us at lunchtime today. I'm just going to do a brief medical introduction because you basically want to get on to the legal aspect. Talking heads are very boring, and you can quite clearly see that I've had a bad hair day, which is in common with the Louis there. Matt, of course, doesn't have that problem, but apart from that, I'm going to take you through with a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation, because that just sort of helps me know what I'm actually talking about. So hopefully you can see that all on your screens now. And what we're going to talk about is obviously what concussion means in relation to the current parlance. And dementia is the word on everybody's lips, and there are about innumerable numbers of dementia. There are 10 types anyway that are commonly recognized, the common of which is Alzheimer's disease, which was described by a German doctor in 1906, and he rather modestly didn't describe it as Alzheimer's disease, but it was named after him in 1910. So we're talking about something that's been around for about 100 years, and that's followed by vascular dementia, and that is something that you can get in early life. So you can be a 40-year-old with dementia, having never played sports. It's a small percentage of the numbers, and dementia and Alzheimer's is the leading cause of death on death certificates now in the UK. So there is a lot of it about, regardless of the sporting connection. And when you're talking about the sporting connection, this was first brought to light by what most people will remember as being called punch-drunk syndrome in 1928. But doctors, of course, don't like things like punch-drunk syndrome. So after a short discussion, they called it dementia pugilistica in 1937, when it was officially sort of named. So there we are, an association between dementia and older boxers. And the study was done by a pathologist, neuropathologist at Imperial College in 1973, where he looked at 24 brains of people who'd been diagnosed with dementia pugilistica. Now, these brains are still in store, and they were recently reviewed as a part of a PhD study by Mark Goldfinger to look to see whether these boxers had any evidence of CTE, which again we're going to discuss a little bit later, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And CTE can only be diagnosed at autopsy. By definition, it is a post-mortem diagnosis. So when you hear about people being diagnosed with CTE in America, it's actually CTS. It's called chronic traumatic syndrome, and it's a collation of symptoms and signs that they are trying to correlate with the post-mortem findings, and that, of course, is not complete yet, because, of course, you can't actually correlate until the individual has died and you can do a post-mortem on the brain. So Mark reviewed 14 of the 24 brains where there was a good medical history, where there was clear evidence that they had slurred speech, poor memory, and the average age was 69. And only 6 had CTE alone. 1 had CTE with Alzheimer's. 2 had absolutely no neuropathology whatsoever, nothing that could be found at autopsy in their brain to explain their symptoms, and 5 had mixed pathology, which did not include CTE. So these 14 cases that you might expect to be 100%, 100 out of 100, 110 out of 111 would have CTE, did not show that. So you can have the symptoms without having CTE. It's been clearly demonstrated. So what you also need to know is this idea of sub-concussive episodes. Prior to 2000, which is again only 20 years ago, concussion was associated with loss of consciousness. You need to be knocked out. If you were knocked out, you had a concussion. You weren't knocked out, you just had a bit of a ding and you saw a few stars. And it was classified as mild, moderate, severe. And there were about 35 different ways of managing concussion at that time, which means that obviously we quite clearly didn't understand it. And the best way to understand subconcussive impact is boxing. You have an uppercut perhaps that produces a concussion, but along the way you have a jab, 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 which is producing impact on the brain. And you have that in contact sports where human to human impact, like American football, rugby, ice hockey, and you have it in high-speed sports like horse racing. If you fall off at 40 miles an hour and your head is 3 meters above the ground, the chances of you getting a bang on the head are pretty high. Ski racing and motor racing. So when you look at the spectrum, concussion actually is relatively rare in most sports when you compare it to the number of sub-concussive episodes. And despite the bad publicity that boxing gets, amateur boxing has very, very low rates of concussion, particularly compared to horse racing and Aussie rules football, both of which have the highest rates of concussion in the recorded literature. And I think universally everybody understands that a concussion is bad for you. There are long-term effects from repeated concussion, and they don't need to be repeated very often. You can actually have long-term effects from just a single concussive episode. And there is clear evidence that in some sports, contact and collision and combat sports, individuals can suffer from CTE, depression, memory loss, and a variety of other neurocognitive problems. And this is also correlated by the fact that when you do MRIs, or rather more sophisticated PET scanning or functional MRI, you can actually see changes in the brain that occur as a result of concussion. Many of these resolve over time, and we don't know the exact implications that those involve, but basically your fate is sealed when you've had your concussion. Whatever is triggered by the concussion is irreversible. There is no treatment for it. All we do is remove you from the sport for a period of time until we think you've got better, and then we stick you back in again. But that is not treatment. So when you've had your concussion, whatever happens in the long term will be determined by how often you get concussed and your genetic makeup. Genes determine everything in our life. You can smoke 40 cigarettes a day for the whole of your life and never develop lung cancer. You can not smoke at all and develop lung cancer early on, and this is determined by your genetic makeup. And there are some people who are designed to be concussed. We call them the wooden heads, and they can be involved in contact sport, and they can have multiple concussions, and they show no signs of any problems, and they end up as presidents of international federations involving contact sports, and are quite clearly unaffected by that. At the other end, you have people who are extremely sensitive to a bang on the head, and we call those the glass jaws, and they can have maybe one or two and may have prolonged symptoms afterwards, and may have long-term implications as well. So when you're looking at any sport or any particular high-risk activity, you're required to do a risk assessment, and the first thing you're meant to do is remove the hazard if you possibly can. If you can't remove the hazard, you have to mitigate the risk in the best way possible, and that's absolutely standard HSE protocols. Everybody understands risk assessment. So I'm going to take you through horse racing. If you want to race horses, you are going to fall off, and jump jockeys fall every 18 rides, and when they do, the chances of them getting concussed are very high, which means that concussion is inevitable. So we can't remove the hazard, which is the horse and the hard ground. So what do you do about mitigating the risk? And you talk about protective equipment, and you put jockeys in helmets. But helmets do not stop you getting concussion. There are no helmets designed to this date that mitigate concussion. Helmets are designed to stop you having skull fractures and major head trauma, for which they are very, very effective. So if you can't remove the hazard and you can't mitigate the risk, you then have to have informed consent. And that's what you'll be discussing a little bit later on. You have to explain to the participants that what they're doing is a very high risk activity, and that there may be long-term implications, and they have to consent to do that. So when you're looking at ways of mitigating the kind of problems that you might expect in a contact sport, the Canadians are way ahead of the rest of us, and research done by Calgary into youth ice hockey showed that body checking was the main cause of concussion in kids. And so they basically banned body checking in the Pee-wee age group, and concussion virtually disappeared from that completely. And it's been so successful that they've extended it up through the age groups in some provinces. So if you look about where your concussion comes from and you can change the rules, you can have a significant impact at the end of the day. And I recently had a bit of a dialogue with some of the cricket authorities about, really, do you need to have bouncers in youth cricket? Yeah, I mean, bouncers are designed to intimidate the batsman, and if cricket is so boring that you have to have bouncers, then so be it. But it would seem to me that it's unnecessary to have balls flying around the heads of young kids. So when we're talking about the diagnosis, we're talking about where you go with this particular problem. And as I said, before 2000, there was no unified definition of concussion. What you were diagnosed in Australia was different to what you were diagnosed in Australia, in the US or here. And so in 2001, all the experts convened in Prague, and the first ever agreed definition of concussion. So if you want to be pedantic, concussion is a new disease. It's only 20 years old, because before that, nobody was actually talking about the same thing. And there have been regular concussion consensus meetings every 4 years since then to update the enormous amount of literature that is coming through to bring the criteria up to speed. The most recent one was meant to be taking place last year and is actually taking in Paris in November. So that's the concussion the spectrum. It's regularly reviewed. And in 2005, Benidorm Malou, a coroner on the west coast of America, described the first case of CTE in an article for which he was ridiculed. 3 years later, he wrote his most famous book, Play Hard, Die Young, which was based on 3 cases of CTE. So we're talking about, in the published literature, regardless of the dementia pugilistica, the 1920s, 1930s, and 1970s review of boxing. 2008 was the first 3 cases of CTE, and that's only 12 years ago. That rapidly picked up, and Anne McKee and the group in Boston had 85 cases by 2012. And one of the cases they looked at was somebody involved with severe head banging behavior, which was obviously not, he didn't knock himself out every time he was doing head banging. He was having multiple sub-concussive episodes. So when I'm asked, I say that sub-concussion became an issue around about 2010, 2012 in my timeline. By 2015, everybody knew about concussion. The NFL settled a $1 billion lawsuit. The film starring Will Smith, Concussion, hit the cinemas, and CTE was defined by a group headed up by Anne McKee and the Boston group. So basically, if sports had not got their act together by 2015, there is likely to have been some kind of legal implication, because I think 2015 is the sort of year of knowledge, and that's now 5-6 years ago. So pitch side diagnosis protocols are inexact, and there is no disease in medicine where there is a time limit on diagnosis. When you go into A&E, the matron does not say to me, "You've actually got 12 minutes or 15 minutes to diagnose this person's multiple sclerosis," or "You've got a time limit on you, otherwise they're back on the street again and they'll have to come back to outpatients." So there should be no time limits on making a complicated diagnosis, specifically in relation to concussion. And there are no parameters that we currently measure that will predict whether you're going to get into trouble in 20 years' time. You may be fine now, you may have 9 concussions and still be being returned to play, but nobody will be able to tell you whether you're going to get into trouble in your early 40s. And don't forget, return to play is return to the concussion factory, because that's where you were concussed in the first place. So I always align it with asbestos. If you have an accident in an asbestos factory and you're cleared to return to the asbestos factory, you're putting yourself at risk again. So the return to play is an issue of informed consent that is an area that particularly interests me, because normally it's about saying to the individual, you've fully recovered from your concussion and you can go back to play, and that is quite clearly baloney, because you may have a number of your symptoms have settled, but there is no way of telling that individual that they will not end up with long-term consequences based on the kind of protocols we've got. So the risk associated with it needs to be clearly explained. That's it for me. I'm available on an email now, Michael at ICHIRF, if you want to contact me, and I'm happy to answer a few questions if there's time for that. If I say your question is very interesting, it means that I actually hate it and I'm unlikely to answer it at all. But I'll take what you throw at me and we'll see what we go.
Thank you very much, Michael. That's very helpful. There's a lot of disinformation, misinformation and misunderstanding around this topic. And that level of clarity is very welcome. Can I just, for my part, ask one question before we go to the panel and see if they have any questions? It comes from your last point that in most sports where someone suffers a concussive incident, they are kept off the sport for a particular length of time. What is the scientific basis for that length of time? What's your view on that?
What you're doing is reducing exposure. All right. So, when you're removed from the sport, you can't have another concussion. And the time that you spend away from the sport, the longer, the better. So when we started in 2000, many of the protocols involved people being off for a month, or in boxing 3 months. And everybody was putting pressure on us, bringing the time off down. And it got closer and closer to a week. 6 or 7 days was pretty common. And I think that trend has now been reversed, in the fact that there's very good evidence that you haven't fully recovered. Your brain function can show rather sophisticated changes that continue for weeks after that. So this is a huge bone of contention. How long should you spend off? And of course, it's usually based on a number of parameters. The standard concussion assessment tool, which looks at your symptoms, and the neurocognitive, which is a kind of IQ test to see whether your reaction time has returned to normal. But as in everything else, there shouldn't be one size fits all. Each individual concussion needs to be evaluated in its own case. And whereas before, as I say, if you'd asked me this in the early 2000s, I would have been quite happy with 7 days off. I am, deeply unhappy with 7 days off now as being the sort of norm.
Thank you. So Matthew, Ian, David, are there any questions you'd want to raise of Michael at this stage before I turn over to David?
Louis, can I just ask in relation to the timeline that Michael brought up in the date of knowledge comments, the international consensus conferences on concussion, Michael, what standing do they have in the timeline of building the knowledge around the subject?
The difficulty is that you can't do research on concussion. You can't take a rugby player, hit him over the head with a cricket bat, and establish how quickly he recovers. So you have to go by consensus, which means you bring a large number of people into a group, and you ask them a number of questions. In our case, it's 12 questions, which start with diagnosis and return to play, and you try and find a consensus. But by its very nature, a consensus will have people who disagree strongly with it, and there will be people who feel that the consensus group has too much influence. But there has to be some kind of gold standard, and the consensus has become the gold standard in most regions. It's hotly disputed in the US, but in most other parts of the world, we agree that if you get 50 international experts on concussion in a room, and they agree on the diagnosis of concussion, that is the diagnosis that we will go with. So yes, the consensus group has a very important role to play, but it will have there will always be people who say that it doesn't represent their own views. And indeed, because it's reviewed every 4 years, there are a number of people in the consensus group who say, rather like I did now, that it's no good quoting me back what I said 10 or 15 years ago, because I don't actually believe that.
David, can you tell us something about your involvement in the sport of rugby and your experience from a player's perspective, not a personal memoir, of concussion? Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Michael. That was slightly harrowing from my perspective, and I guess slightly worrying how many questions I might have, but I think maybe we save that for another time. So I guess I'm going to try and give my perspective on my latest experience, and I guess what the feeling is around players and around concussion. So as was mentioned earlier, I played probably since 2009. I've been playing professional rugby. I started playing for Scotland in 2012, and most recently was at Leicester Tigers and was forced to retire due to a concussion that I sustained. So I guess if I briefly run through my experience, the last experience that I had with concussion, I was playing again for Leicester, took what I thought wasn't a particularly big hit in the game, hit the deck, was very was pretty shaken up pretty quickly, but not that badly. And then suddenly, a good description of it is always as the cloud descended, and you sort of become very unaware of where you are, what's going on. I'm in the middle of Twickenham, and I had no idea what was going on. And then I ended up on oxygen in the medical room, and then that evening I felt fine. I met up with a few friends that evening in London. At this point, we had a pretty good understanding of concussions, so there was absolutely no alcohol drunk, as that tended to have adverse effects. But for whatever reason, I didn't feel too bad. And then the next day, I kind of felt the same. And then a year and a half later, I still felt the same. So I think the frustrating thing for me was there was never a period where, well, there were a couple of periods, but not a prolonged period where I was locked in a room, in a dark room, trying to get rid of this agonizing headache, or prolonged periods of, falling off a bike or things like that. I had moments that were hard. I think any time I was trying to get back to exercise in particular was very difficult. In the past, a lot of players had spoken about, and I'd experienced that exercise sometimes can be really good for getting rid of the last bit of symptoms. But in my case, there were a couple of times. You can imagine the most frustrating thing as a professional athlete is the goalpost continually moving. So for me, if you do your ACL in your knee, you're out for 9 months, you get your head around it, you do your rehab, you do what you can do to do better. If you do your Achilles, it's a really bad one. You're out for 9 to 12 months. It's a long time. With concussion, it's so difficult because you just don't know. I know multiple people who get stretchered off to hospital, are completely unconscious for a long period of time, wake up and feel 100%. Wake up the next morning, none the wiser. And then I know people who get very innocuous knocks to the head and never play rugby again, or never play a contact sport again. And that was the thing that I found the most challenging. Is I woke up the next day, I felt okay. I took concussion very seriously, and I knew I wasn't going to play for the next week or two, regardless of how I felt. I just wanted to be careful. But in my head, I thought, right, I'm going to take a couple of weeks off, get better, and then I'm going to play in the next European Games. Autumn test coming up, go back and play for Scotland. Then that didn't happen. Then the next goal came around. I was like, okay, I'll push for the Six Nations. The next goal came around, and all of a sudden I'm trying to push for the World Cup. And then lastly, I'm just trying to not have to retire, trying to put myself into a position that I'm not going to have to stop playing rugby. And I guess the final straw was like, right, well, that really isn't the biggest concern here anymore. And what is the long-term ramifications for my health? I was a new dad at this point, and is what I'm doing, in the best interests of my family. So probably 9 months in, I was told by a neurologist it was, the time was coming that if things didn't get better, he was going to recommend that I stop playing rugby. And yeah, things didn't get better. We tried pretty much everything. I mean, I got every medical check you can get pretty much to make sure it wasn't something else that was causing me to feel the way I did. I think if I was going to be told to retire, I wanted to make sure that it was exactly what they were saying. And I wasn't going to wake up in a year's time and suddenly think, oh crap, I could have played another 5 years. I was 28 at the time. So I had a few miles left in the tank for sure. Anyway, yes, I retired, and like I mentioned earlier, it wasn't for a year and a half before I started feeling improvements, which was incredibly frustrating, as I'm sure you'd imagine. But how have perceptions changed? I think it's amazing looking at some of the stuff that Michael put up there and how quickly things have developed since I started playing decent level of rugby at school and then coming through into the professional game. I think when I came through, there was still that macho air about the game. And in Scotland, we were very lucky. We had our team doctors very has always been very knowledgeable on concussion, and he was he really pushed the importance of concussion awareness. So we were always very careful, but there was always that kind of back channel change room chat. And I've seen that change over the years. And I think what I got really lucky, I don't know whether it's luck, but when I got my final concussion that kind of ended my career, I was old enough and established enough that I wasn't in a position where I had to go and play. I didn't go and have to play to put bread on the table. I was fairly comfortable that when I got back fit, I was going to get back into the team and I was going to be able to keep playing. I think even today, where issues may come up is for young guys coming through the system. If you're a 19, 20-year-old and you take a knock in a game and you've got a minor concussion, and then all of a sudden the first team coach comes up to you and says, look, we've got a few injuries. This is your chance to play. Then all of a sudden there's a lot more pressure that these guys will put on themselves. I don't think there's the same pressure from clubs and from international teams or from various teams. I don't think there's much of that. You hear whispers of it, but from my experience anyway, the pressure to play is the pressure that's put on yourself. And concussion's a weird one as well, because you come into training. I was going into training for at least 6 months, going in every day. I looked like there was nothing wrong with me. There's someone on the physio bed next to me who's just done their Achilles and they're on crutches, and it's very visible why they're not playing. Whereas I'm coming in, look 100% normal, but there's something not quite right going on in my head, which, I don't know, from my perspective is obviously much more frightening. But yeah, so I think the game has moved on a lot. And I think the awareness around concussion has been brilliant. And I think World Rugby are doing as much as they can at present. And I'm sure they've got a lot in the works at the moment. I think we've seen the American sports in particular, there's a lot of movement there since the lawsuit against the NFL. In terms of tackling is an interesting one, because I think in many ways you can't change too many rules in rugby without fundamentally changing the game. I think what they're doing in terms of tackle height and just taking that part or mitigating that risk in rugby, and that if you hit anything above the shoulders, we've seen it in the last two rounds of the Six Nations, people getting hit in the rucks and red cards getting shown straight away. And obviously one of those was with Scotland, which from a personal point of view was, fairly disappointing, because I think Scotland, it was a big impact on the match. But from concussion in general, it was a very interesting one, because now we've had 2 in a row where breakdowns have, I guess, been the area that have caused these big head knocks. And it could be interesting that potentially maybe we don't have people being able to jackal over the ball anymore. That could be an interesting rule to look at. Other than that, I think the 2 areas that are kind of in discussion, or I've heard whispers about, that I think would be really good is, first and foremost, from rugby's perspective, more space. There needs to be more space created. Defenses are so much better than they used to be. Players are so much bigger, physical, and more powerful than they used to be, but so much fitter as well. So the collisions you're going through in a rugby match are a lot more significant than they used to be. So they need to find ways to sort of make these collisions smaller. And one area that's been mentioned is less substitutions. So you've got a few more tired people on the pitch, which I understand has its risks in terms of potentially fatigue playing a role and getting your head in the wrong place. But I think making more space on a rugby field without having to take players off the pitch, that seems like a good angle to look at from my personal point of view. And secondly, I believe this, tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe this happened in the NFL. I think the no-brainer for me is to bring in a limit on contact in training, because there's absolutely no limit. It's all down to an individual coach's discretion on the level of contact or the amount of contact that players do. I've been at clubs where we do 1 contact training session a month. I've been at clubs where we do 3 contact sessions a week. And if we speak about the sub-concussions and the potential cumulative effect, which again, we're not 100% sure where these long-term issues are coming from. I think that's something to bear in mind as well. But yeah, in general, obviously, it's me having to retire the way I wanted to, or not being able to retire the way I wanted to was obviously very difficult. And the time that I spent with these symptoms, the time that I spent having these issues was obviously not great. But I think the more we can make people aware of concussion, the more we can make sure everything's done legally in the right way as well, to look after the players, the better. And yeah, I guess that's me, and I'll look forward to some questions from anyone who wishes to ask them.
Well, thank you very much for that. That was more than informative. Can I pick up on the last point, and then I'll hand over to some other questions from the panelists. It's the issue of education, and my experience in the world of sport, very much as an outsider, notwithstanding we share the same athletic frame, is that education starts from within the sport. You know, when was it a topic in your experience that was being talked about in the dressing room, in the changing room, and at training? When was the concern about concussion something that picked into what you as a group of players were discussing and your concerns about it?
I mean, fairly recently, to be honest. Like it's always been there that I guess the medical professionals I worked with when I was younger were aware of it, but when I went professional was pretty soon after they just stopped the blanket 3-week rule. They were like, before it used to be you get concussed, you're out for 3 weeks and that's it. Then once I started playing was when they sort of brought in the tests and the various other ways of checking. But I mean, on the tests, for example, I was passing those tests with flying colors during sort of after my career-ending injury. But so that there's so many sort of holes in the system that are really, I'm no expert. I don't know what the solution is, but the point is that everyone seems to respond so differently to this, and it's so hard to know, I guess, what the impact is. And now, definitely now, people with the, I don't know if they want me mentioning this too much, but with the various legal action that's been taken in rugby at the moment, people are a lot more aware of it. It's getting a lot more press, and I've had countless players calling me since my retirement, asking my opinions on things, which is fairly uneducated, other than the fact that I've spoken to several people in Michael's profession, and I've had advice from a lot of very qualified people. But yeah, it's definitely something people are starting to get concerned about now, because at what point is the risk too great for the reward we get? We are so lucky to be able to play a sport that we absolutely love and get paid for it. It's incredible, and I know I never took it for granted, and a lot of the people I played with never took it for granted. But at some point, I think players ask themselves, if the risk of me getting a degenerative brain disease is X, then the reward's not good enough. So it's kind of working out where that is. And as you get older, the sort of balance starts to weigh itself out. At the start of your career, I don't know, from what I've been told, the chances are fairly low of one of these issues. I hope Michael won't correct me on that. But so maybe at the start of your career, there's a little bit of risk in everything, and maybe at the start it might be worth it. But once you've got a 2-year-old son sleeping next door, and once you've got mortgages to pay and things like that, maybe those risks aren't worth it.
Thank you. And Michael, can I pick up something with you that David raised, and that we've had a couple of questions on it, that in NFL, I think they did stop or limit the amount of contact you can have in training. And a couple of questions are targeted at that. You know, how can you best encourage people in grassroots sport, and how can you best protect children exposed to the risks of head injury?
Yes, the NFL, I think, have limited in the top end of the game, contact training to 1 day a week, and obviously that trickles down through college and high school sport. The problem is that I think there's quite a good evidence that, you know, the younger you get the concussion, the more serious the long-term implications potentially are. You have this problem of the sort of growth spurt. So if the whole of youth sport is rigorously under 10, under 11, under 12, under 14, with no consideration of body size and maturity, I think you're opening up a whole area of problems for you in the long time. So when you look at the New Zealand model, you know, the Auckland Rugby, if you go to their website, you'll see that for every age group, there's also a weight requirement. So, you know, if you're going to play in the under 12s, you have to be, you know, under 32 kilos or 40 kilos. And you're then getting a situation where you've got people of similar mass playing with each other, and you reduce the risk dramatically with that. And you appreciate that, you know, boys of 13, there are some who are late developers who will be small and wispy, and there are some, you know, South Sea Islanders who are fully mature and weigh, you know, 250, 300 pounds, you know, when they're 13 or 14. You know, when Jonah Lomu first appeared on our screens, you know, he ran down the pitch with 2 or 3 people holding onto his ankles as he decimated the opposition. That's rather changed now, but that translated to youth sport is a big issue. It is a big issue for me. So I think little people playing against each other. I have, you know, grandchildren who sit around on horses, who play rugby, and I don't get hugely fussed. And my daughters are always phoning me, you know, telling me should they give up. And the answer is no, they shouldn't, as long as they're enjoying it. But you know, a significant hit or a significant fall might well make you rethink about, you know, whether they're going to be a career, are going to be a gold medalist show jumper, or are they going to play, you know, rugby for Scotland, or are they just, you know, taking a bit of fun at a weekend. And what David was saying is really quite common. I had a physio who was playing, was picked up on a weekend match. They were short of somebody to play for the B team for the university, so he pobbled along and played. And he lost essentially 4 years of his life. He could no longer study for physiotherapy, and he couldn't concentrate. He had terrible headaches, and similar to what David was talking about. And that's not at all uncommon. And it's about 15 to 20% of people who have concussion have lingering and long-term problems that are acute. And that's got nothing to do with the CTE and the long-term problems, which we can't predict at all.
Can I ask quickly before you go again? I was going to ask this after you finish talking, Michael, and I've had answers to this from relative people, and it differs from time to time. But to what degree are the symptoms and the damage proportional?
We don't seem to have any correlation. It's what you were talking about again. We don't have any correlation between the size of the impact and the severity of the concussion. So you can have what you would consider to be a very small ding, but you can have then catastrophic headaches for 18 months afterwards. Whereas you can be unconscious for an hour and a half and wake up frisky as a cricket and pass all your tests. The problem is the tests we have are totally inadequate to completely measure you. And even when we're doing MRIs and functional MRIs and very sophisticated tests, we've not got anything that really tells us, you know, where we recovered. What we do is say, you know, before you took up rugby, you were a miserable beggar. All right, okay. After you've had your concussion, we've done a number of tests, and you're still a miserable beggar, but you're the same miserable beggar you were beforehand, and you can go back to your sport. But that we haven't really evaluated whether you've got any long-term implications from that, because there's nothing that we can do. So the tests look sophisticated. You see all the specialists as you've done. You know, many people go from one neurologist to another, always being told, you know, it'll just take time, wait, and time will, you know, time will heal. Well, sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. We don't really understand why that is. So the size of the impact, which was the size, you know, your question, and the number of symptoms. The number of symptoms is associated. The more symptoms you have, the longer you're going to take to recover, inverted commas. So we know that, but that doesn't correlate with the long-term effects.
Okay.
Matthew, is there anything you wanted to ask of David before we move over to Ian?
Just out of interest, David, you were obviously quite clued up about concussion before you sustained the later concussions anyway. And you suggest that your knowledge stemmed, I think you suggest, from a particularly good Scotland doctor. And I'd just be interested to know what your impression was in terms of whether the guidance and education and advice was coming down from national level and not so much from club level. So is it from World Rugby and the national teams,
or
at a lower level?
I think a lot of it's the same as anything, Matthew. I guess you can be in an organization with a great boss, and you can be in an organization with a crap one, if you know what I mean. And I think in some circumstances in sport, you can be there with a fantastic doctor who's does his research and stays up to date on all these kind of things. And I definitely know of some places where they certainly weren't. But again, these aren't places that I was at necessarily, by the way. But yeah, the boxes are ticked. These days, the boxes are ticked, definitely. I think conversations are definitely had. The last few years of my career, for sure, every single season started with a concussion session, and I'm trying to think how it can be done better. I think it might be different now. Maybe people don't take the mick out of concussion. They realize how serious it is, but these sessions as well, you can imagine at the end of a training day, people in pre-season have done X amount of sessions, they're exhausted, and you can sometimes lose the value in a session. So yeah, the answer to your question is yes, there is from the top down, there is definitely communication now. I don't necessarily know if that's always been the case.
And it does beg the question, doesn't it? Once you get down to amateur level, what sort of advice, if any, amateur level clubs are passing on to players, given that they haven't got professional medical teams and what have you?
Oh, well, my brother was playing in games, and I was astonished. At times, I can't remember if he said there was no medical professionals. There's definitely no doctors, but I get you can't have a doctor at every single rugby match that's going on around the world. But yes, and it would be massively difficult for the governing bodies to sort that kind of thing out. And I know they do make a big effort to do so. But I mean, the reality is there's going to be stuff. People within the clubs need to be aware of all this stuff, not just the medical professionals. You need so many more people involved and educated in this area. It's fine for someone like me who, when it happened, I had access to fantastic doctors and neurologists and all these things, but so many people are playing on a pitch in the middle of nowhere for a bit of a laugh. They get a bang on the head, go into the change room, have 5 beers afterwards, you know what I mean? So I do imagine there'd be areas in that respect as well.
And then you've got junior level, where you've got, as Michael's pointed out, even more vulnerable brains. Yeah. And again, the lack of medical input pitch side. And it's down to a referee who may not be particularly experienced and a volunteer coach to assess kids' conditions after a head knock. Yeah,
well, there's a young boy in Scotland who died a few years back, and I've done some stuff with his parents before. They've set up a concussion awareness thing, and it is frightening. But it's the issue with concussion as well is it can be really hard to spot. If you're like, we get it in ultra high definition on a TV, and some people don't spot it. But if you're sat on school pitches and there's parents around the pitch screaming and shouting and things like that, it can be hard for these things to be spotted. So I think from my perspective, it's got to be done. And Michael mentioned it earlier. It's the logical place to start, is make sure it's right in the schools, make sure it's right with the young people. They are fully aware of what's going on, and the people around them who are coaching them and teaching them, they need to be fully aware of it. Now, I don't, maybe for really young players, you can maybe limit contact or whatever it is. But I think making young rugby non-contact would be a mistake, because from X age, because then all of a sudden you get kids going through puberty who now only start tackling now, and then their technique's not as good, as then all of a sudden you're getting more concussions. I think it's a bit different now, but when I was at school in South Africa, there's a lot of, like Michael mentioned, there's a lot of variation in terms of children's size there. And I didn't see very many concussions at all. But that's if you've got someone teaching correct tackle technique, and if these kids are learning it from a young age when they're smaller, I do think that's good. But look, I'm no expert on that side of the game, but I think it's a very good place to start. If people are fully aware of that from the bottom up, then it can only help.
Right, David, we're going to come back to you. We're going to come back to you, Michael. But I thought rather than become too drawn in to the interesting aspects of medicine and to the player's perspective, we should introduce some law. And the law coming up starts off with Ian, and then after Ian, there'll be Matthew.
Thanks, Louis, and thanks, David, for your contribution. I think the Ben Robinson case was one you were referring to at the end, and I mean, it is heartbreaking, but in its own way, it's quite a good segue into the liability issues that we'll have a look at, because it was the second knock that Ben had, and we look at protocols now and think, well, would it be allowed after a first concussive incident to carry on and for that second knock to occur? So a tragic story, but yeah, a great link into this. So, well, thanks to Louis, and good afternoon, everybody. As Louis said, the legal obligations section will be covered by myself and Matthew, and over the next 15 minutes or so, we'll take a look at, firstly, the potential tortfeasors, i.e. those people who may be considered liable in any claims, and the cause of action that concussion injuries may give rise to. And then secondly, Matthew will look a little bit deeper at a couple of the legal issues that run through those particular claims. But because of the limits on time, you'll be pleased to hear that you'll be spared a lecture on establishing common law and statutory claims for negligence. But one of the interesting features about concussion claims is that so many principles of personal injury law do crop up. And to list some, but certainly not all of those, issues around limitation, date of knowledge, jurisdiction, establishing whether a duty of care exists, consent, contributory negligence, valenti, indivisible injuries and material contribution, provisional damages, amongst many others. And as I say, even though that list is extensive, it's not all of the issues that can arise. So they are interesting cases, and from a professional point of view, there are numerous rabbit holes that we can disappear down into. Therefore, for today's purpose, Matthew and I will touch upon some of the issues and the features simply to introduce them as subject areas for discussion. So please do formulate your thoughts and questions. We've got plenty of time for questions and answers, and I know there's lots coming through on the chat function. If it's possible at all, please do put those on the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. It just makes it slightly easier to order those and make sure that we do come back and respond to the questions that are coming up. And one final introductory comment. Predominantly, we will end up defaulting to talk about elite rugby, but much of the analysis and commentary will be applicable to concussions arising in other sports and all levels of those sports. So, potential tortfeasors and cause of action. I'll have a quick look at four areas. So, governing bodies, individual clubs, medical professionals, and players. And kicking off with the governing bodies, who determine how the sport is governed. They'll set the rules of the game, how those rules are applied and modified. They will act as a disciplinary body, and they will invest in and promote the sport. As such, governing bodies have a significant say in the commercial activities of participants in the sport. And it's that commercial relationship that begins to confer a duty of care. And once a duty of care per se has been established, the court will have to determine when it is reasonable for advances in medical understanding of concussion to be carried across to the governing bodies, such that a legal obligation is created. And a determination on that date will provide a point in time where it is deemed reasonable to expect steps to have been taken for adjustments in the rules of the game and to limit the likelihood of players suffering short and long-term injuries. And I found Michael's contribution at the beginning and the timeline very interesting on that date of knowledge point and establishing when it's likely that a legal obligation can be created and can be argued is established. But amending the rules of the game only goes so far. Governing bodies have to also demonstrate the effectiveness of the steps they've taken. And as with implementing changes and establishing changes to the rules, the governance and implementation of those steps has to be enforced. If clubs flout the rules, that must be a means through through which those who fall under the auspices of the governing bodies can be challenged and held accountable. I'm sure we can all think of examples where we've witnessed a head injury only for a player to be sent back onto the pitch. And in these circumstances, scrutiny falls on those who were involved in the incident itself, but also the governing bodies to demonstrate that the policies and protocols are effective and being implemented appropriately. Moving on to the individual clubs, the long-established common law and statutory duties conferred on employers in relation to their employees are all relevant when assessing concussion injuries sustained by players. Employers must ensure that a safe system of work exists, proper training is provided and undertaken, fellow employees are competent, the right equipment is provided, and a safe system of work is adopted. And in a claim against a club, there will be no issue in establishing the duty of care exists, and the rubric for assessing whether the duty has been breached is long established. Causation of that injury itself is also likely to be straightforward, but the defence that will invariably be advanced is that players willingly place him or herself in the way of harm, and thus that voluntary assumption of risk precludes a claim being brought. But furthermore, whilst clubs will advance defences against the players themselves, the contractual arrangements with medical teams will also have a significant bearing on how claims proceed and who is found to be liable. So looking at the medical professionals within the clubs, if either or both of the doctor and physiotherapists are employed by the club, then the club is vicariously liable for their actions. And if the medical services are provided under an independent contract, then the doctor and or physiotherapist will be a defendant in their own right. Once the contractual relationship is determined, liability will, of course, be decided by the way in which concussions were managed by the medics. Were the assessments accurate? Were the return to play protocols adhered to? What are the consequences of any errors? And some consequences will be immediately evident, such as returning someone to play too soon, resulting in subsequent concussive injuries, which prolong the player's recovery or even curtail their career. However, there can also be longer-term cumulative and indivisible consequences, as Michael explained to us at the beginning of the seminar. Also worthy of note when assessing the actions of the medical team is that provision of medical care is provided under very different dynamics within a club or sporting environment. Within a GP practice or a hospital setting, the sole focus is, or at least should be, the patient's best interest. However, compare that to a sporting environment where the focus of the leadership team and the head coach specifically is to win a particular game and to have the best players on the pitch to do so. It's not inconceivable that decisions that are deemed best for the team may conflict with the best interests of the player. However, notwithstanding any acknowledgement of the differing environments and dynamics for sports doctors, the standard of care that is expected is the same, and the medics will still be assessed under the Boland principle. And falling short in provision of treatment will not be defensible through a submission that such medical care was provided outside of a typical medical setting. Now, the final word from me at this stage is to conclude with a short point that players need protecting from themselves. And I could probably just leave that there, particularly on the back of the way that Dave spoke about things and the examples that he gave. But just referencing the Daniel Goldberg paper of 2008 entitled Concussions, Professional Sports and Conflicts of Interest. Amongst other things, that paper confirms that what we all witness when watching most levels of sport, but particularly the elite level, namely that players will not leave the field of play of their own volition, and particularly in the context of a head injury. And the consequence of this is that it does create more of an onus on all those who have a responsibility for player welfare to firstly remove the player from the field of play, and secondly to manage the return to play in a way that allows the player to recover from the head injury that has occurred. And with that, I'll wrap up from my side. I'll hand over to Matthew to pick up on a few of the issues and expand a little bit further. Matthew, over to you.
Thanks, Ian. Obviously, this is a pretty embryonic field of personal injury, but I anticipate that the cases that we're going to see will fall into broadly three categories. The first one, which there's no need to dwell on today, is an acute concussion caused by serious foul play on the part of an opposition player. And we know from judicial decisions, it's a high hurdle to get over to establish that a player is guilty of negligence on the field of play. Generally speaking, in broad terms, you've got to establish recklessness or a very high degree of carelessness, and judges have been slow to do that. That's not to say they're impossible cases to win, but they're not easy. The second category, which we are more concerned about for the purpose of today, is the failure of governing bodies to devise and activate adequate concussion protocols and provide adequate guidance and education to filter down through the individual sports. And the third category is the failure of governing bodies, clubs and medical professions to ensure the implementation and adherence to the protocols and guidance. And it's fair to say that that's the majority of cases we're seeing at the moment fall into this category. Time is limited this lunchtime, so in the next few minutes, I'm just going to flag up what I consider to be the two central battleground areas in categories 2 and 3 of the categories I've just outlined. The first one is what's known as date of knowledge. So that's knowledge of the risks posed by concussions and now subconcussions to participants in different sports. This will be the central issue in claims against governing bodies. And it's obviously the hot topic at the moment, given the recently initiated claim against World Rugby, the RFU, and the Welsh Rugby Union. In terms of legal background, there's been a long established duty on employers to keep abreast of health and safety issues in the workplace. And traditionally, courts have been quick to find employers liable in this respect. And that probably stems from policy factors, mainly the imbalance between the power of employees and the powers and resources of employers. And I think in the sports world, we've got exactly the same imbalance between participants and governing bodies, leagues and clubs. But when a sports governing body will be deemed to have acquired sufficient knowledge that demands positive action on their part, will of course be very fact and sport specific. But I anticipate that the central factors in coming to a decision on whether a governing body is under a duty to act is the quality and reliability of the medical research, and also how widely publicised and disseminated that research is. And Michael's already touched on this, but if medical research isn't universally accepted, or there's any suspicion of bias, then you can see that a sporting body has certainly possible justification for inaction in relation to that research. We obviously don't have time today to analyse particular cases or sports in detail. And Michael and Ian have both touched on the timelines in development of the knowledge and changes in concussion in different sports. And we've got boxing, the dangers became apparent in the early 20th century. American football, we're talking about the late 20th century. But in closer to home, rugby union and proper football, association football, it's only more recently that medical links have been made between tackling, jackling, or heading the ball in football and potential brain injuries. And that is at the core of these claims against governing bodies. So some arguably random observations on the area of data knowledge. Well, from my perspective, the evidence linking subconcussive injuries to the mainstream UK sports, rugby, football, is by no means universally accepted, even now. And that is a potential problem for claimants. The Concussion in Sports group, which has been mentioned already, and holds its 4-yearly consensus conference. I know this year's has been obviously postponed until next year, unfortunately. That their pronouncements are widely considered to carry a great deal of authority, as Michael's pointed out. But they are funded by the sports industry. And therefore, even that body isn't immune to the suggestion that it has conflicts of interest or even bias. Now, I'm not for a minute saying that there would be any foundation to that suggestion against the CISG, but I just use it as an example of the potential grey areas and the potential arguments that can be thrown up when particular medical research is funded by a particular body with a vested interest. The billion-dollar settlement of the NFL case in the US in 2015, that in fact involved allegations of fraudulent suppression of medical research by the NFL. So it went a lot further than an allegation of a failure to respond to evolving medical science and delays on their part. Unfortunately, as we know, it was a no liability settlement and the issues weren't properly aired. And so in some senses, we're none the wiser. But it remains to be seen whether there may be similar fraudulent claims in other jurisdictions and in relation to other sports. It may be unlikely, but we can't rule it out. There's one final personal observation. Having watched an interview with Keith Wood recently, the former Irish and Lions international hooker, who's always worth watching. He pointed out, as David has this lunchtime, that back in the day when he was starting out and when David was starting out, even as long ago as when I was playing, there was a 3-week mandatory minimum period off games when you sustained a concussion. Now, that's changed in more recent times, and it went down to 6 to 7 days in rugby union and rugby league. And it's only very recently that the mandatory minimum period has been increased for adults to 19 days, and I think for younger players under 23s, or I can't remember the exact age limit, but it's 23 days. It's a bit longer. Now, that history of concussion protocols just in rugby does beg the question whether those changes were justified or on medical grounds. And I bear in mind that there were, as the mandatory period went down to 6 to 7 days, the return to play procedures and the testing obviously improved and became more rigorous. But it does seem strange, doesn't it, with the increased knowledge of concussion, that the protocol or the mandatory minimum period off playing went down so substantially. And so it's not just a question of governing bodies acquiring the initial knowledge to introduce the protocols, but they obviously need to stay abreast of the changing medical research and make sure that the protocols continue to be fit for purpose. And it raises the spectre, of course, of competing interests. Because, of course, coaches and clubs want to get the players back on the pitch as soon as possible. And the governing bodies have to resist those competing interests if they are contraindicated by the medicine. So it's a very wide and complicated area. The second major battleground, as I see it, is medical causation. And there are three aspects to the causation issues, I think. The first one is establishing a diagnosis at all. Now, this may not be too difficult in the case of acute concussions and secondary injury syndrome, but it may be more difficult with less well-established neurodegenerative diseases, such as, of course, CTE, which, as Michael's pointed out, at the moment, can't be formally diagnosed until post-mortem. The second area within medical causation is establishing that an injury is attributable to a sporting concussion or a subconcussion. And this may be tricky if there are potential non-sporting or non-tortious factors that affect the individual player. It could simply be age, it could be non-sporting head injuries, it could be other comorbid medical conditions. And the third medical causation issue is in relation to apportionment between defendants. For instance, if you've got a player who's gone through multiple clubs and medical teams, all whose failures have caused him or her concussions throughout their career. And in relation to the attribution and apportionment issues, those are going to involve arguments surrounding principles of material contribution to injury, which again, I think has been, I think a question of David to Michael raised this point. This area draws on authorities from asbestos litigation in particular and clinical negligence. And it's a legally pretty challenging one, frankly, which is obviously very dependent on medical research. But much will turn on whether the neurodegenerative disease in question is divisible or indivisible in the eyes of the law and, in fact, medicine. A divisible injury is one where the degree or the severity of the injury reflects the extent of exposure to the injurious agent. In this case, the number of concussions or the severity of concussions, which was David's precise question. And whether in those cases, medical science might be able to have a decent stab at identifying the extent to which each defendant has contributed to the severity of injury by calculating the number of concussions and the relative severities. But in divisible cases, the claimant will only recover damages from each defendant in proportion to the extent to which they contributed to the claimant's overall concussive symptoms and therefore damages. So a claimant needs to sue all potential tortfeasors to recover 100% damages. With an indivisible injury, it's essentially all or nothing. For instance, a lung cancer. It's not dose related. So medical science is unable to state to what extent one defendant contributed to the injury, as opposed to increasing the risk of injury. And in indivisible cases, all the claimant has to do is show that one defendant, tortfeasor, has materially contributed to the injury. And then he'll recover, or she'll recover 100% of the damages. And it may even only be a small contribution to the overall injury to recover 100%. Now, the input of neurologists and neurosurgeons is obviously going to be critical to these issues going forward. The indication that Michael's given this lunchtime suggests that it is a difficult area. And at the moment, and I'm sure it's going to depend on what particular disease we're talking about, but it looks like indivisible injuries are going to predominate in this field. But again, it's a very embryonic stage. I could, of course, spend the whole afternoon discussing potential legal issues, but I don't suspect that will be very welcome. And I know that there are quite a few questions in the Q&A box, and Lou is keen to move on to open up the questions. So I think I'll leave it there, but I think those are the two areas that everyone involved in litigation needs to be mindful of going forward.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Ian. I read the papers and I watch occasionally TV programs, and on the TV and in the commentary, it always seems much more simple than I know you find it, and I find it too on analysis. What I'm going to try and do is break down and join up some of the questions. I'm going to go back to a medical issues to start with. Then I'm going to deal with an enforcement issue, and then I'm going to come last to a legal issue and see if I can tie some things in that way. Speaking on behalf of a panel that is pale, male, and apart from me, maybe heading towards a bit of staleness, where, Michael, is the science on concussion and gender bias? A couple of questions have come in on whether or not there is a skew or a propensity on behalf of women, females, to sustain concussions more so than men. Is there an evidential basis for that?
Yeah, a large evidence base for that, and it depends on what sports you look at. A lot of research done in college soccer in the US. Women's soccer is absolutely massive, and the concussion rates amongst females at least twice the rate of males. We did a review of women riders, women who ride in point-to-points and under rules, actually fall off less often, but they had a 4 times greater chance of getting concussion than the men. So yes, well established that the female of the species is much more prone to concussion than the male.
And do you have the least clue as to why that might be?
There are a number of theories. The first was that the ladies are much more truthful, that they will tell you that they have got headaches and symptoms and double vision, whereas the male can never be trusted in relation to concussion. The second one is related to neck strength, that the male of the species has a neck like a prop forward and can take the impact, whereas the female of the species has a willowy swan-like neck which is unable to absorb, and again this has been disproved pretty significantly. So we do not know. But there must be something about the chromosomal makeup or hormones or whatever that means that the female brain is more sensitive to concussion than the male.
Thank you. I quite like the truth and honesty exposition myself. The next questions are to do with, in a sense, cheating and enforcement. Has there been an incident of misuse of head injury assessments? And does liability attract if there is a failure by a governing body to enforce head injury assessment rules? I'll answer that, and then I'll turn to David in a sense on those. In terms of misuse, there's been a lot of allegations. Le Belle France ran into a series of allegations in the Six Nations 2017, 2018, effectively using an HIA in the same way that Bloodgate was used to get a player off and on. I don't think anything was established. The obvious point is that if anyone is established to have breached rules in that way, you would hope that the governing body would come down like a ton of bricks on them, though it would, as a prosecutorial job, be a difficult one, because there's a cautionary principle and you have to take precautions, and it depends very much on who said what at any particular time. I would think, and I would encourage, that the rules be enforced, because if a governing body sets up an HIA system and a process under which, if people are at risk of concussion and subsequent concussions, they are bound to go through a period of time where they're not playing. If those rules are not enforced properly by the governing body and or by the club, then that is effectively putting your neck on the liability block and asking for someone to bring the chopper down on it. If you set up a scheme that you say is one that should be followed and you then don't allow it to be followed, you're exposing yourself to risk of litigation. But the question that comes out of those sort of slightly dry legal answers, and I think for David, is what was the sense in his playing time that someone would either play down or pretend not to be suffering from a symptom so that they could get on? And in a sense, you answered that from the latter years of you as one of the world's most successful players who can move out of the sport and live and survive, not necessarily as well as one would have hoped, but otherwise without the sport. It changed during your career. So what's your view on the temptations that are put in front of players' faces to carry on regardless?
Yeah, definitely. It's huge. I mean, it's all of this, along with everything else, really, is based on incentives. Like if people have the right incentives in front of them, they'll do what they need to do. So, as I mentioned before, I know for a fact that in these cases they didn't accept it, to be clear, but medical staff have been approached with the prospect of signing a document to say a player is fully aware of the risk of getting another concussion and things like that, because it for a young player, it can be that simple. It can be one game can give you a 50-cap international career. You know what I mean? If you never get that chance, I think particularly in England, for example, with such vast playing numbers, people might slip through the net, and you can build up the story in your head that if you don't get your opportunity now as a 19-year-old, whatever it might be, you'll never get it. So that's definitely something to be considered. And I think if we look at the NFL as well, this isn't so big in rugby, but in the NFL, a lot of these guys are paid per game they play. So if you're told, right, for every game you play, you're getting $1 million, you've got to be pretty seriously injured not to play that game. And I think that's an issue that a lot of them do have. Again, not necessarily an issue in rugby. But then the other side of it now is, I guess, the subtle pressures there are. So, and again, I don't think this is as prevalent anymore, but if you're in a, and I've seen it, if you're in a situation where the medical staff are under significant pressure to get players fit, and then suddenly you see them that sort of just subtly being a bit less strict around the issues, and it might be the same for players as well. If players feel they can get away with not mentioning something, they might do it. Again, I think those days potentially are gone. I think everyone's very aware of the dangers and the risks of concussion now, or I hope so. I haven't seen much of it personally, but no, in the past, there's definitely been people that have tried to work around it for the sake of playing or for the sake of being a tough guy back in the day. And it's, not a good idea, to say the least.
Thank you. And I'm just going to drift into what may be the least amount of time to answer a legal topic ever. And the legal topic is informed consent. And it ties up in a number of different ways, but answer it perhaps, if you would, either Matthew or Ian. If a child goes to school and the school warns parents of the risks, does that absolve the school of any risk of liability for anything that goes on the pitch? And the second aspect to that is an interesting question of whether or not having independent doctors either give informed consent advice or be the assessors of whether a player could go on and play in a match after suffering a concussion-like injury. And does that make a difference? So you've got as long as you want, but more than 2 minutes, I hope.
Well, can I firstly deal with the parents of the child point? There's been quite a lot of noise in the media, hasn't there, recently, over players consenting to the risk of injury. And in particular ex-international players talking about willingly accepting the significant risks, particularly on the way up. They'll do anything to represent the country. And I think perhaps people in David's position were in a much stronger position to say, no, enough's enough. I've got plenty of caps and I can see my life ahead of me. And a lot of what's been said and a lot of what's been put down as hysteria amongst parents is unsurprising, but it is pretty much irrelevant from the point of view of litigation, because players and parents simply cannot legally consent to negligence. So as long as parents are adequately informed of the risk of concussion, and the good thing to come out of the media coverage is that over the last few years, well, it's a downside from the point of view of, for instance, rugby, that parents are becoming less willing to let their kids play, but at least they are fully informed. But once they give consent, they're not consenting to any form of negligent treatment on the part of coaches, referees, school doctors, and what have you. You simply cannot consent to negligence. So I think there's a bit of hype surrounding valenti and consent issues, which is in fact not a very significant issue from a legal perspective. The important thing is that the message is getting out there, as David's identified. And so everyone is, whether it's via a doctor or via the media, is becoming much more aware of the dangers. And so everyone's consent is more informed. And I think that's the good thing to come out of what the media would put down as hysteria.
And the last question on independent doctors, and I suspect will have to be the last question, is I can see at elite level that the RFU or WRU might then be able to pay for an independent doctor to stand on the touchline. At amateur level and at league level, that's quite an expensive cost. But what, Michael, do you see to be the attraction for an independent doctor being able to pretend to be able to do an HIA and reach a definitive conclusion as to safety in 10 minutes on the side of a pitch? And how much would you want to be paid to do it?
I thought we were going to leave this with the legal people. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, I have to tell you, Louis. The idea of the independent doctor is clearly that the individual doctor of each team is biased and is unable to make a valid and independent decision and is likely to not act in the best interest of his patient. Which is a presumption that, matters covered. Doctors should be able to make a decision which is in the best interest of the individual they're treating, not the club or the country. But I've never been a great believer in the independent doctor, and I think it was sort of forced on individual sports because of individual incidents that we've discussed over the last 5 or 6 years. That person is by and large, relying on video evidence. As I've said before, what you need to do is be able to examine the patient, for as long as you want and to carry out whatever tests you need before you make a final decision. So, you won't see me volunteering to be an independent doctor anytime soon.
And the legal answer, Ian, independent doctor might help the club get off the hook, but it's going to put someone else on the hook. What do you think?
Yeah, I think we're always going to be realistic about what can be expected, and I think actually I was just about to respond to Adam Pendlebury's question in the chat, but I think it sort of bridges over to this point that there are lots of examples of breach of duty where things should have been done differently, and without doubt, a breach of duty can be established, but actually the causation angle doesn't necessarily flow, and therefore people essentially get away with it. The examples in the chat: Steve Smith, David Luiz, Josh Warrington. Hopefully none of those come to any more significant harm, but actually they should have been treated differently at the time. And I think this is where it bridges over from a legal consideration saying, well, breach could have been established but causation was difficult, to then elevating it to actually this is an awareness point. This is actually where the promotion from the governing bodies comes in to say, well, actually, this isn't about people being sued and so on. It's about making sure that player welfare is at the heart of the decisions that are taken and the actions that occur. And with that, whether that sort of carries across to how people are conducting matters on a Saturday at the local rugby club, whether there's a doctor on the side, it really is a matter of general awareness and acting on that, which I think we have moved on significantly in the last few years. But actually, I feel that is the key role of the governing body, is to be promoting that message.
Thank you. And with the thoughts being that player welfare is paramount, we should draw it to a close, because I've taken you all past your lunchtime. And although our attendees have listened with great care and enthusiasm, we're taking them away from their lunches too. So for my part, can I thank everyone who's spent time watching us, but more importantly, can I thank Michael Turner and David Denton, Ian Christian and Matthew Phillips for giving up their time, knowledge, skill and expertise. No doubt this is a topic that can be revisited, and one day perhaps we will. But let me now say goodbye to you. Thank you to my panelists, and good afternoon.